a massive fleet of ships lands in Japan carrying over 40,000 soldiers. They quickly overwhelm the Japanese and begin pillaging across the countryside. Great. So far this sounds like a Mongol history video. But what if I told you it was actually Japan that was invading? No, seriously. In 1274, a Mongol fleet did invade Japan, and it almost worked. Only divine intervention saved the Japanese from Mongol domination. And when I say divine, I mean literal. The Mongols got blown away by a typhoon, which is pretty embarrassing for a power as invincible as theirs. Or at least, that's what they were made out to be. But let's pretend that the Mongols had won. What would the world be like if the Mongols had conquered Japan? Why don't we do a little experiment here on the Worst Case Scenario channel? Let's assume that the Mongols invade Japan twice, and both times are successful. Yeah, I know it's a bit unrealistic, but bear with me here. In 1268, a Mongol and Korean coalition fleet invaded the southern Japanese islands, but they were repelled by the Japanese navy. However, 4 years later, a larger Mongol fleet landed in northern Japan and things didn't look good for the Japanese. Samurai warriors were no match for the Mongol horde, and soon the invaders were at the gates of Tokyo. Faced with certain defeat, the Japanese turned to their gods for help. And wouldn't you know it, a typhoon appeared out of nowhere and destroyed most of the Mongol fleet, killing or washing away most of the invaders. This event became known as the Divine Wind, or more accurately, the Divine Winds, since it happened twice. Now, obviously, this wasn't actually divine intervention. It was just a really lucky coincidence. But the Japanese sure liked the idea that their gods had saved them. And so they built temples to the gods of the southeast wind in order to ensure that their backs would be covered whenever there was a threat of invasion. So now let's imagine that this didn't happen. What would a Mongol-Japanese empire look like? Well, first of all, there wouldn't be much of a samurai class left. By the 13th century, the samurai had become a rigid warrior aristocracy that dominated Japanese society. Under Mongol rule, they would have been demoted to an underclass, much like the Korean and Chinese scholar class had been. Their lands would have been confiscated and given to Mongol nobles, who would have overseen the construction of new cities and the co-organization of the Japanese people into trade and agriculture. There would have been some resistance, of course, but not enough to stop the Mongols. The Japanese were simply too fragmented politically to mount an effective defense against the Mongols. Even if the samurai had somehow managed to defeat the Mongol invaders, they still wouldn't have been able to stop a second or third attempt. The Mongols weren't deterred easily. Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, actually did attempt to conquer Japan in 1279, but his fleet was blown off course by another typhoon. Kublai would go on to conquer most of China and establish the Yuan dynasty, but he never forgot his failed campaign against Japan. He would make 2 more attempts to invade, but both times his fleets were again decimated by typhoons. Either Kublai was really unlucky, or the Japanese gods were really angry. Anyway, under a Mongol-friendly regime, Japanese culture would have been heavily influenced by Central Asian and East Asian cultures. The Japanese language may have looked very different if it had absorbed more vocabulary from Mongolian, Korean, and Chinese. Buddhism would have become even more popular in Japan, and Shintoism would have likely died out. Japanese art would have become more abstract and less realistic, and Japanese literature would have focused more on poetry and calligraphy. Basically, it would have become more like Chinese art. There is also a chance that the Mongols would have used Japan as a base to invade the Korean peninsula again. After all, Korea was the bridge between the 2 great Mongol capitals of Karakoram and Beijing. It makes sense that they would want to secure their western border by subjugating their unruly neighbor to the east. Now, I know what you're thinking. Surely the Japanese people wouldn't have accepted Mongol rule so easily. And you're right. There would have been rebellions, revolts, and full-on wars between the Mongols and the Japanese. But let's be honest, the Mongols had a much better chance of winning in the long run. The Japanese were never unified under one banner. Even after the Mongol invasions, they would continue to fight each other for centuries until a dude named Oda Nobunaga finally united the country in 1573. By then, though it would be too late, Japan would never be the same after the Mongol invasion. It would be a shadow of its former self, a shell of the nation that could have been. So let's take a moment to thank the Kamagazi for saving Japan from the Mongols. Thanks for watching.